when people talk about not wanting Idaho to become California, what they're really talking about is overgrowth, overpopulation without smart policies in place to prevent homelessness in the first place.
Kaylee, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I am doing swimmingly. The coffee is hot. I'm excited for this conversation. You are an Eagle resident. You're running for Congress. You've been at this for a while. You started in 22 and now it's just full-time campaigning.
Exactly. They recruited me from my freshman year in college, mainly because there was no one else interested in running as a Democrat at the federal level in Idaho. There's no money, there's no resources, there's not a ton of support or infrastructure there. And I ran for the first time in 22 and just absolutely fell in love with the work. And so I've been doing it full time ever since.
Okay, talk to me about the work, because as we were mentioning before we got rolling, like campaigning is such a thankless thing, and politics in general is just, man, it's brutal. Every time I talk to people that are either campaigning and trying to get the word out on their particular issues, or the people that have been in for a while, it's just a slog. It's a bear.
It is. And I think I'm kind of in a lucky position because I really do love the difficult conversations. I really do love the travel. I love getting to understand all of these communities and industries and getting to know Idaho a lot better. And so for me, it feels a lot like a privilege. I was always really political, even really young. None of my family are, so they're not sure where it came from. But when I was 8 years old, I wrote the Clinton administration, like complaining about how they handled Kosovo. And I was just always really political. I love policy and I love community and I love Idaho. So I get to mix all of those things together and do it full time. And not a lot of working class moms in my position get to run for Congress and have this kind of platform. So there's also the flip side of that, which is feeling privileged and really trying to take advantage of this opportunity.
Listen, I mean, we need people like you. Talk to me about policy that you like. Talk to me about policy you dislike, because that's what I was just having a conversation with a couple people, and one of the guys was saying, hey, look, we don't want, and he's like, people that move here in particular don't want this area to turn into something like San Francisco. And I said, yeah, nobody does. But what I rarely hear are people that are outlining the policies that led to San Francisco becoming San Francisco. Like, people say, hey, we need to stop the wokeism. Okay, well, on a policy standpoint, like, what do we do from a policy standpoint? Because nobody's saying, hey, we need to make sure we protect the laws that allow law enforcement, for instance, to be able to remove personal property from sidewalks. We need to make sure that people can't stay somewhere for more than 24 hours. We need to make sure we enforce our parking and zoning regulations so people can't park domiciles like in front of the state capitol. Like, these are policies that lead to encampments. We also need to enforce, obvious common sense prosecution of, for instance, drunken disorderly conduct or open containers in public, right? Like what I was saying to them. When I was in college, I was going to Berkeley. I don't like Berkeley at all. In fact, I hate Berkeley. I really enjoyed the education. But when I was in college, if I walked down the street with a bottle of beer and it was open, I would get arrested or get a ticket or something. But the guy taking a leak in the gutter, shooting heroin right next to me, would not be convicted at all of anything. So these are things that lead to homeless problems. And I don't hear people talking about that. So when you talk about you love policy, what policy do you love?
The only policy I don't really love is the social media soundbite policy, where it's funded by special interests who are trying to get people as angry as possible so that they'll show up to the polls for whoever supports their agenda. That's the only policy I don't like. But when we actually take it to real life, you bring up a great point, which is when people talk about not wanting Idaho to become California, what they're really talking about is overgrowth, overpopulation without smart policies in place to prevent homelessness in the first place. So what I would look at is, how do we develop in a wise way to prevent what has happened in other areas experiencing similar growth? And that means diversifying the kind of development that we put into communities. One of the issues that we have is really pricey, low-density residential development, which is great, but then how do we house our workforce population? How do we house our low-income working-class families? You have to throw in kind of smart investments to make sure that there's enough diversity in a community to prevent the homelessness in the first place.
Okay, but okay, if I may. San Francisco doesn't have homeless who are like, dang it, I could have afforded $900,000 on the condo, but it went for 1.1. So now I'm homeless. Like, they don't have homeless because there is a lack of MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.
That's fair. And I mean, if you want to compare, Boise and Eagle, we are, 30 years behind San Francisco. So it's trying to catch these things ahead of time. But then you also look at, we have blue states that have incredible social programs. And so what we ultimately have are people in rough situations then traveling to get to those cities. So it makes the problem even worse. And I'm old enough to remember when we shut down state-run hospitals. And so I'm old enough to remember when all of a sudden the homeless population just increased exponentially because we stopped funding state-run hospitals that were used for mental health and substance abuse treatment issues. And so when we don't have those programs in place, we're still paying for it. We're still paying indigent services. We're still paying as a community for these problems, but we're not doing it in a smart way that's actually going to curb the problem. It's just kind of putting a Band-Aid on it and hoping that one day we'll stop paying for it.
Let me ask you something. Do you think that the homeless problem is really that we don't have, for instance, state-run hospitals that have resources, and because they don't have those resources, they can't get better? Or do you think that it's, hey, we actually do have viable resources, but we also have policy that was put in place, I believe it was like the 70s or 80s, that prevented people from being essentially incarcerated within hospitals to deal with. Like, I had a friend in college whose mom had schizophrenia and it was bad. And they had gone through these bouts of getting her mom treatment and she had started recovering really well. And then she would just fall back into it. And my friend was telling me, she said, look, my mom is great when she's on treatment. And my mom is, when she's receiving the help she needs, she's doing really, really well. But the problem is we cannot keep her in the hospital. We can't force her to be hospitalized to get this treatment. So she elects to leave and then falls back into, a lesser state of existence. Do you think is that we don't have resources, or do you think that we give people agency in a viable enough host state, and that's what leads to homeless problems?
I mean, there are always going to be instances in which somebody personally is not going to accept resources that can help them get to a better place.
Sure.
But the large majority of what we're seeing right now are people that aren't finding other options. And you have a mental health crisis, you go into the hospital, but the waiting list, they have only so many beds. And so they're trying to get people in and out as quickly as possible. And then you have Idaho already, which is underserved for mental health resources and treatment options. So the lines to get into these resources are unbelievably long. And the whole system is just weighted down. And I know that homelessness is an issue. And I think that when we look at smart development in Boise and Idaho, we want to try and prevent the same issues that have happened in really overpopulated cities like San Francisco and New York. But those aren't really the issues that I hear people in Idaho dealing with on a daily basis.
Right. I was just going to say.
Yeah, it's not something, when I'm in Weiser or Kamei or Grangeville, there isn't a large, homelessness issue. It's mainly just trying to ensure that working families can make enough to survive.
Okay, so let's get back to this, because again, I don't know exactly how we got on that SF. I don't really like talking about other states because I think it's nonsense to talk about their problems when we're not facing the same. It's like, yeah, there are some homeless people downtown Boise, but it's not something that warrants this level of concern, right? Most people are concerned about, for instance, affording gasoline, affording their heating bills, things of this nature. So when you talk about policies, aside from, it sounds like you think that we need to have more like higher density, affordable housing. Is that because you were saying low density, expensive housing is a problem?
Well, it's just making sure that we have some kind of system in place to make sure long-term our cities are going to be okay. Agricultural land, it's going to kill me right now. It's either, I think, 39 cents or 59 cents per every dollar that they get in taxes to keep up agricultural land for the county. But then low density residential is $1.29 for every dollar that they get. So it's far more expensive. So you want to make sure that, one, we're preserving smart agricultural land and good soils so that we have that kind of industry in the long term. You want to make sure that it's not just low density residential, but also high density, affordable workforce housing, which places like McCall and areas up in North Idaho are really struggling with right now because we didn't anticipate anticipate that. But it's not just about making sure we have housing, but making sure that the counties can afford the kind of developments that we're putting in with the tax revenue that we get, which is a huge issue for Idaho, especially considering, we're 63% federal lands. So tax revenue needs to be a huge consideration.
Okay. When you say making sure the counties can afford the developments we're putting in, what do you mean? Like, let's look at Ada County. Where is Ada County at risk of not affording developments made by, say, Boise Hunter Homes or something else?
It's just the cost, for every low density residential, right? It's $1.29 or $1.30 for every dollar they get in taxes, because you have to make sure you have the education, the doctors, all the infrastructure to support that kind of neighborhood building. Whereas if you have a smart balance of agricultural, high density, low density, all of these different factors, then you make sure there's smart balance and that we're getting enough revenue to really adequately make sure that there's infrastructure there for those communities to be successful. And I mean, it's kind of a local issue, I know, as a federal candidate, but I think that it's just one really great example of where smart policy solutions are available, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about there's too much growth or there's not enough growth. We're not talking about how to make sure this growth is long-term successful for everybody in the community.
So your idea would be to increase or have a smart collection of growth, which includes more high density, lower footprint, so we can increase the tax receipts from the county so that we can fund the burdens of the community.
Right. It's difficult because we have all these I remember Eagle back in the early 90s when it was just farm fields, and we've now sold off and developed almost all of that land. But if we don't regulate somehow the kind of growth that we have in these areas, one, we're going to lose incredible agricultural land and good soil. Then we're going to have issues where working class families that have lived in Idaho are not going to have a place to go. And then we're going to have an issue where the tax revenue is not really in keeping with the infrastructure necessary to support that community. And at the federal level, there aren't a ton of policy solutions, but I think it's a really good way for people who are concerned about the amount of growth in Idaho to look at how we should be viewing these problems instead of, well, Californians are bad or this is good or
Sure.
Instead of that kind of social media rhetoric, really talking about, okay, well, this is what's in front of us right now. And real leadership would be sitting down at the table, talking about what the issues really are, what the policy solutions really are, and how we find a good balance for everybody involved.
So how do we, you brought up, let's say more growth in Eagle, because Eagle still has farming, right? And you said, look, we need to regulate how this is done. What does that mean? Because we have very strong personal property rights here, right? And if there's a farmer who's, farmed a plot for either his life or multi-generations and it's their retirement and they want to sell it off to the highest bidder because they should have the right to do that theoretically. What do you mean by, hey, we should regulate this or sit down with them to work it out?
So across the state, we've seen a few instances. I hear personal stories all the time of what happens is you have land that is specifically designated to be agricultural, residential.
Sure.
And then once that growth starts, you start getting conditional land permits. So I've heard about dairy farmers who are in agricultural spots, and then all of a sudden there's these conditional land permits coming in. You've got low density residential kind of building up around, and all of a sudden that neighborhood outnumbers that dairy farm and starts complaining about the smell of the cows. And then all of a sudden that becomes an issue and people lose out on their farm. There's just, and once again, we are talking about local issues. This would be more what a state representative or governor or, mayor would be talking about. But it's an issue, especially because it's on the top of everybody's mind. When we look at the population growth, which has just exploded,
Excuse me,
and you look at social media sound bites, and it's kind of ironic because I come from 6 generations of very old school Idaho farmers who have all been Republican. And I usually only bring that up because people will tell me, go back where you came from, go back to Portland, go back to San Francisco. We don't want you here. And I'm like, well, there's nowhere else for me to go. This is as much home as it possibly can be. And a lot of the conservative voters that I talk to are actually people that have moved here for conservative policies. And so that it's just about how this rhetoric is not really true to life with the experiences of the people that I'm talking to, and how we have to, as leaders, refocus the conversation in constructive ways.
Okay. So we may wave a magic wand. You're elected. What are not just reframing the conversation, because I think that's an easy enough thing. It's like, hey, let's start talking about this. But what are the things that, first off, you feel like are not being talked about? And what if you, as a lover of policy, what are those policies or potential policies, hypothetical policies that you feel like would really add value here?
You know, for me, top of my platform is always going to be on government accountability, because until people start actually trusting that the government is going to work for them, then we're always going to have low voter turnout, low participation, and it's going to hurt us in the long run. So for me, I like to champion things that make people distrust the government: banning congressional stock trades, implementing term limits, comprehensive campaign finance reform, making sure that your congressman or your representative is not taking money from special interests to decide their committee seats or to decide their votes on legislation, that they're only concerned about the impact on Idahoans and their lives. And then on top of that, I think it's working class issues. Idaho has been right to work, and it has failed most working class families. And so ensuring that we have collective bargaining rights, which I know is a scary term for a lot of people in conservative states. I actually had a discussion in Riggins where a gentleman was like, so I'm supposed to purchase my sheet metal through Jimmy Hoffa. So there is kind of this idea of 40, 50 years ago when the unions were that strong. But when I go around and I'm talking to unions in Idaho, I am just talking to Idaho community members who have come together with other employees to take a lot of pride in their work and in safety regulations. So that means making sure that Idahoans are getting paid a fair wage, have access to health care, that their pensions are protected, that they have safety regulations, that they're safe in their work environment, and that they have some kind of ability to then bargain for their own rights against really, in the most case, large out-of-state corporate interests.
Talk to me about that then. Like, explain. You're saying, hey, look, the right to work has failed Idahoan working class families. Like who? Like what companies? Or like any? Because I know it's as an idea, but I really want to know, because I've seen instances, I think everybody who's existed, excuse me, across broad industries has experienced problems with unions. That's not to say every union is bad, right? Absolutely. But what do you mean when it's like, hey, I saw this company in this area grind down the community. It was a community or business town or whatever it was. Like, what do you mean?
Okay, so I'm not going to name the companies because
Let's call company A.
Company A. I don't want to hurt that relationship because I represent working class issues, but I still don't want to in any way disincentivize economic interest in the area.
Of course.
And so, I want to be able to work with these companies in the future. Yeah. But for instance, Company A, right?
Company A.
There's no requirement, even though there's a large union presence in this company, there's no requirement that they have to join a union to then work there. So you have your unionized employees who have kind of checks and balances on themselves, on their employers. But then you have these other employees that are able to work at the corporation without being a part of the union. But then those employees' behaviors still kind of count against what those union employees are then able to bring to the table as far as data.
How do you mean?
So you'll have a company, right? And they're bringing in new people. They're paying them very little. Once you get close enough to make a raise, then they might let you go and then hire somebody else for a lower rate wage. That way they're not having to pay out the same kind of pensions. They're not having to pay out raises. You have employers that are working people with crazy overtime, working people to the bone. There's very little safety regulations. Idaho has, unfortunately, a really high rate of injury and workplace accident, especially in non-union workplace sites. So you have all of these different things. And then when they go for contract negotiations, they can say, well, this many employees didn't show up on time. This many employees aren't that productive. So why would we then give you an advantage in this contract negotiation? And it's like, well, those people aren't a part of our union. Well, it still impacts the negotiation and what they're able to bring to the table. But I think the overarching problem is that we have a massive union presence in Idaho, and yet they don't feel that. They don't feel like they have the collaboration or the power to really make the kind of impact. So I think what Right to Work has really done is kind of cut unions off at the knees. We have 70,000 members of just one major umbrella union in my district alone. And yet when you go to these membership meetings, there's very little talk of how to collectively work towards better workplace conditions because Right to Work has kind of cut them off at the knees.
So you're saying that within your district, there's a 70,000 person union presence. and they're unable to improve the conditions of those that they represent, or
no, they do make a huge difference. Let me just clarify that. We know for a fact that productivity in America has gone up, like 69%, while middle class wages have stagnated. We know for a fact that a large percentage more union members have access to health care, have protected pensions, have a guaranteed retirement age. We know from the data that union members are treated and make far more money than those people who are not unions. What I'm saying is that right to work took away any kind of authority or balance that that union members had compared to corporate interests who have zero regulations. They have zero accountability for how they treat their employees, what they do, how they pay, other than federal minimum wage.
Okay, but like we have OSHA and stuff. So to say that there's no protection or nobody looking at how corporations treat their employees, that's a little disingenuous.
I mean,
I can't open a restaurant and hit people. Right.
I mean, it's not, that's where I want to get away from. It's not all or nothing. The real answers lie somewhere in the middle. And what we've seen is, and it's devastating, because I'll talk to job stewards from the Potlatch lumber mill from the 1980s who remember the right to work drummers coming in. And then all of a sudden people were getting laid off. They weren't getting paid as much. The raises weren't coming. Their pensions weren't guaranteed. So there is a massive difference. And we see it in the data. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden things are crazy and an employer can set you on fire. There are still some regulations, but we know for a fact that when unions are involved, that workplace safety is higher, that work conditions are better, that people have a better quality of life, that they make more money, that they have better retirement plans. And so the basics are kind of there. And when we look at corporate interests and what they've been able to do in Idaho, we see very little accountability. And
explain that to me, if you would.
Well, I think
you keep going, like, come back to the mic, or move and take the mic with you, whatever you want to do. You keep going sideways with it. Okay.
Normally I talk with my hands.
Dude, you're good. You're good. Keep going. Use your left hand. Just go like this.
I think for me, this has become a big issue because my opponent, Russ Felcher, does town halls across the state, and we've been present. And so when we listen to him, he'll often talk about how our highest priority needs to be to deregulate economic interest on federal lands, how we need to deregulate and make permitting processes easier for corporations. But then I look at when corporations come in, and we've deregulated to such a point that they have no impact fee accountability. There's very little accountability for what they're actually giving to these communities that they're moving into. And then what we've experienced in places like Lewiston is as soon as that economic activity is dried up or the profits dry up, they bounce and they leave that community in economic ruin, struggling to come back.
Let's talk about this then. So first off, and this is actually a very interesting point. So when the profits of a corporation dry up and that corporation's like, okay, I'm no longer financially viable, we have to shut our doors. What could be done about, when you're saying like, hey, first off, you're talking about Lewiston specifically. All right. So you named a place. What corporation are you talking about?
The big box stores. The big box stores.
Okay. So say Costco moves into Lewiston. Not that it did, but say Costco moves into Lewiston and it's making a certain amount of money initially. And they realize, hey, we are no longer economically viable. They leave. How is Lewiston, one, being slighted by this? And why are things worse?
The accountability to the employees that they hire right now. And I mean, we're all looking at what happened after COVID, which is all of a sudden wages went from $8 an hour to $18 an hour. And so everybody's like, look at these incredible wages. But if we actually look at if wages would have increased with cost of living, then we know for a fact minimum wage should technically be $35 an hour. If we're looking at what minimum wage was 20 years ago compared to what it is now, we know that we are actually losing money with what minimum wage is in this country. And that's $7.25. Nobody's paying that anymore. It's now $18. But that's still half of what the value of minimum wage was 25 years ago.
Okay, but let's come back to the idea of accountability, corporate accountability, because I'm not sure what you mean by this. What do you mean?
It's different for every single situation. And so it's difficult. When you have fossil fuel companies that are coming in, it's the oversight for soil and water contamination and the cleanup afterwards. I know tons of miners and loggers that really require these kind of companies to come in for incredible job opportunities. But then if there's some kind of mistake or oversight afterwards, it's really a relatively minor fine. And these communities are left to deal with the cleanup. You have big box stores that come in. There's very little actual thought to the impact that it's going to have on small businesses. There's very little accountability for what they're doing for their employees. They're often paying low wages with no benefits, barely paying overtime. And then these people are then, a lot of times these corporations are then subsidized for employing low-income families.
Okay. If I may, it sounds like you're talking about a much broader swath of talking points regarding
at the federal level, yeah.
Okay, but help me understand that where I live. Because what you're, and again, this is what you're doing. You campaign, you talk to local people, you say, hey, these are some issues that I would like to address. And I love policy, which is what you've said. So you brought up Lewiston. Let's look at a big box store. What is the policy or problem? And it's not that I'm not, like unaware. Like, first off, Costco is kind of a bad idea because Costco actually very much takes care of its employees.
Yeah.
Winco is employee owned.
Right.
Home Depot does not seem to be raping and pillaging.
No.
Not to say that Ace Hardware loves
All right,
that Home Depot.
Let's do Walmart because everybody loves to hate on Walmart.
Yeah,
and I'm never going to work with Walmart.
You're hitting the fossil fuel companies and Walmart. You're going after like the two biggest boogeymen that we have nationally. I don't like. Let's talk about more things.
That's because I'm not against big business. I want
Well, if you just hate the Walmart family, that's fine. Or if you hate Chevron, that's fine. But like, what's the policy? Like,
the policy is for fossil fuel, for natural gas, for any kind of drilling on federal lands, for all of these things that Idaho does quite a great deal of. We need to have far better oversight and actual consequences for if companies are not following regulations. The truth is, and a lot of times, there are regulations in place that are supposed to protect communities from this issue. The problem is that their profits are so incredibly high that they just tie these tiny fines into their budget, and then our communities are left to deal with the fallout.
Is that a big thing in Idaho?
Yes.
Okay, like what are the mining or focil fuel companies in Idaho that have done this? Because I would love to find out.
Southeast Idaho has a real issue. The Nez Perce tribe just won a $5 million settlement against a company, and it's really the first kind of in its place to show litigation can be a successful maneuver for these communities that suffer this kind of issue.
And this was a fossil fuel company?
Yes. It was a mining company. And then you have, we even have Dorothy Moon, who there was a leak into the Salmon River. Dorothy Moon said we should erect a monument to industry in its place. Well, that's not funny to the hundreds and hundreds of, I think it's 2,500 Idaho families who survive off of salmon fishing in the river.
Wait. So a company leaks nasty stuff into the Salmon River. And in response to this, Dorothy Moon says in context specifically that was a beneficial thing and we should erect a monument.
I never said she said it was beneficial. She said we should erect a monument to industry. That is the direct quote.
No, I know, but I'm saying in response to this thing, she's saying, hey, I acknowledge that they spilled this nasty stuff in and we should erect a monument.
Yeah. You talk to people in Riggins and that's the story you hear.
Okay, wait. Because if we talk to people, we hear a lot of different stories. What I'm saying is,
I had a staffer check this out, so we saw the article.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So
yeah.
So Dorothy Moon is on record for saying that in that
we
context.
should erect a monument to industry in a place in which our river was contaminated. And that's the kind of, I don't understand, because middle-class families have so much accountability. We pay property taxes, sales tax, grocery tax, all of this accountability for our impact on communities. Why do we not have some semblance of that same accountability for large companies and organizations? And at the federal level, that's where we can really thrive with legislation. That's our purview. That's where we can have a real impact. I want the same accountability for the government and congressmen and large corporations and mining companies. And I want consequences for when people break those laws. I mean, we live in Idaho. If you try and break into somebody's house, you're likely to get shot. But a corporation can poison the water or redirect water out of your water table. And it's a $1,000 fine if they get caught. And so I just want to make sure that we have the same standards for these corporations and the government and these businesses as we do for working class families and middle class families. And that includes entrepreneurs and small businesses. Unfortunately, a lot of times in our language, they kind of feel left out. And I feel like small Idaho businesses often think I'm grouping them in to this accountability. But the truth is that regulations on small businesses is far harsher than it is on these large businesses that are coming in. And so I want to make sure that our entrepreneurs, that our small family businesses, that our small farming families are not crushed under the weight of regulation, while we then turn a blind eye to these large out-of-state interests that are coming in and really utilizing our communities with no sense of accountability.
There's a lot. There's a lot here. There's a lot. Here's a question for you. Speaking about Salmon River and the Nez Perce, what do you think about breaching the dams?
I thought when I started running in 2022 that abortion or something like that was going to be the most divisive, difficult issue, but it's not. It is 100% the dams and breaching the dams. And it's interesting watching the misinformation that gets spread about this, as if it's the Biden administration is coming in and clearing out these dams so that we can restore the salmon population. This has been a private litigation. This is a private matter over probably more than a decade. We've had these stakeholders trying to get some kind of salmon restoration efforts in where it is crippling right now. And what's frustrating is that not a single representative from the first district at any time tried to find a solution. I think the salmon restoration effort cost $26 billion, and it has completely failed. It is the most expensive salmon or species restoration effort in the history of mankind. And not once in 10 to 12 years has any of Idaho's congressional delegation come in and said, okay, how do we find a solution here? What can we try? How do we bring these stakeholders to the table and figure out, well, if these dams are breached, how do we mitigate the losses there? You know, you had Mike Simpson who had this proposal, and it was to try and kind of breach the dams and then mitigate any impacts to power, water, all of these different things. Russ Fulcher at no point brought stakeholders to the table and figured out, okay, well, the paper mill out of Lewiston, it runs at capacity because of steam run off the dam. How do we mitigate this issue? Because Russ Fulcher doesn't get a say. It's not really Congress's purview. Now, we can try and make sure that in this case that we're making sure the port of entry workers, that our Lewiston port workers, everybody's covered in that. But I mean, it could very possibly happen with or without Congress's approval. So I'm tired of this, well, we should or we should not. Well, this is where we're at because nobody was trying to find a solution for the last 10 years. So now what are our options? If we breach, then how do we mitigate the damage to the mill, to the power loss? But then there's also misinformation floating around that, you know, these 4 lower Snake River dams are responsible for flood control and irrigation, which is absolutely untrue. Or that the amount of power produced by these dams would take this much carbon emissions. Well, that's also not true. That's assuming that they're running at full capacity, which these dams haven't done in a very, very long time. The actual power outage is much smaller than what's being said online. So it's just trying to make sure that the facts are accurate, that we're having productive conversations. And the truth is, we can't pretend like we're all powerful and what we say goes. So if these dams are breached, how do we make sure we're mitigating the impacts to Lewiston and those surrounding areas, to the employees, to the people that are actually going to feel the impact, instead of kind of just sharing on social media that you're against breaching the dams? Well, this is where we are. Somebody should have been getting the Pacific water users. Somebody should have been getting the grain growers. Somebody should have been getting the mill workers. Somebody should have been getting these stakeholders together over the last 10 years. And figuring out, okay, well, what have we tried? What haven't we tried? What do we do? Like, what do we do in case this isn't possible? And then we don't often talk about the number of Idaho families that rely on salmon. And I'm not just talking about the tribe, even though it is incredibly important to the tribe. I'm talking about the number of families. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it is a shocking amount of income loss to small Idaho farming families or businesses that survive off the salmon they catch from the river. I want to say it's like $86 million loss a year because of the failed salmon restoration. So I want to look at the bigger picture. I want to talk about what our options are, what are possible solutions, and I want to get people to the table because none of these people are enemies. The people that work at the mill are not enemies with the tribe. The people that work for the grain growers are not enemies to the mill worker. Like, these are all Idahoans who really should have their voices heard in this situation. And it's unfortunate we don't have leadership to step in and do that.
So, okay, awesome. Incredible information. So it sounds like you're conditionally in favor of essentially breaching them if solutions could be found that would resolve people's concerns.
I am trying to get as well read on this issue as possible. And it's difficult. I'm not a congressman. I don't have access to kind of all the stakeholders in this case. I've been trying as hard as humanly possible to make connections with all of the stakeholders in this case. My understanding is it wouldn't even be fully breaching the dams and that there's misinformation around that, except for I honestly just had that conversation this week. So I'm still working on trying to follow up on what the reality of breaching the dams looks like. But no, I represent Lewiston mill workers. I work with several of our steel workers, our electrical workers. I work with all of these people in Lewiston who would be impacted. So I'm not going to say, of course I'm for breaching the dams. But I am going to say that I will look at this issue comprehensively and try and figure out the best way forward for both salmon restoration and for the communities there, but using accurate information.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
What about water rationing?
This doesn't get brought up very often. At least I actually tried to get to the water users conference this year and unfortunately wasn't able to get there. It is frustrating that we don't have more plans in place. Actually, there was just legislation that came through that was supposed to be about drought mitigation and fire, watersheds and all of these different things. And Fulcher actually voted against that. And so I've been trying to figure out if there's something else coming up in its place, if there's a better option. But right now, it seems at the federal level, we don't have a lot of support. It seems to be kind of just get the Fed out of it, which isn't smart for Idaho because we know that if we got the Fed out of the federal lands in Idaho, that Idaho would crumble under the economic weight of trying to manage those lands.
Wait, back up. What do you mean? I don't I'm sorry. I'm ignorant to this.
Okay.
If we were like, hey, certain amount of federal land in Idaho, and the Fed now manages that. And if we say, hey, Fed, we're taking it over, making it state land, still going to be public, but it's going to be state regulated. You're saying the burden of managing that would be crushing, like managing it as far as wildfires or like, how do you mean?
Land management, fire mitigate, like all of those efforts. It costs money to manage the land.
Sure.
Yeah.
I saw, what was it? Plains Fire and Rescue. Like you have, people putting out fires and blah, blah, blah.
Oh, yeah. And so 63% of Idaho is federal lands. We have one of the largest percentages of federal lands. It makes it very difficult for tax revenue. But, in 2022, and he hasn't been saying it as much lately, so I'm wondering if he kind of took it off of his platform. But he talked often about how we needed to get it back to state control, how the state would know how to handle it, how the state should be controlling the lands in Idaho. And mainly he talks about that in the sense of deregulating the permitting process for industries to come in and drill on that land. So that's usually in the context of when those conversations are happening. But the truth is that if we all of a sudden handed over control to Idaho, we would not be able to afford the management of that land or anywhere near it. I don't want to use the numbers because I'm not 100%. I don't want to give inaccurate numbers, but I know that Idaho would not be able to afford it. And it's not hard to see we can't even really afford the facilities for our public education system. So to then kind of say we should be handing over 63, this massive landmass to state control doesn't make any sense.
Well, these are different items, right? Right. So,
well, yeah, but we only have so much money. We're talking about how we're going to budget. We can't then all of a sudden take over. We would not be anywhere near being able to afford the land management for.
Do we reimburse the federal government for managing the lands within our state?
No. So technically, Idaho gets, I believe it's $1.30 for every dollar it gives in, or basically we receive far more federal.
We're a net recipient.
Exactly. And so I know payment in lieu of taxes is kind of the big issue right now. Like, how do we make sure that Idaho is getting the kind of money off of those federal lands that is necessary in order to properly manage them and also for our state to be economically
viable?
Exactly.
Right. And there's no real, at this point, there's no real viable financial policy that would allow us to get more money off those federal lands to take it over.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have anybody trying to do that. You know, we have people who talk about it on social media. We have
You love the social media reference. Like, what are you talking about? Who are these people?
When I started this campaign in 22,
like,
my
politicians
opponent
are
was
not
a
known
ghost.
to be very good at social media.
But when I started this campaign in 2022, Russ Fulcher was a ghost. When I went around to communities, people had either heard of him because of his involvement in signing the amicus brief in 2020 to overturn the election, or his role in the Freedom Caucus, which is all social media, or they didn't know who he was. He was not in communities. He was not finding solutions. He was not communicating to constituents. You know, the organizations that I was working with had trouble reaching him. I know for a fact that there are major important groups of people in Idaho that were really hoping to have conversations with Russ Fulcher this year about federal legislation, and they can't get a hold of him. And so when I'm talking about this kind of lack of accountability in these social media sound bites, I'm talking about leadership that's faking it. I'm talking about how we have elected officials who are making $175,000 a year, which is more than most Idahoans can hope for, with complete healthcare coverage, all of their travel covered, all of this privilege and power. And then they're not actually doing anything with it. They're not in communities trying to find solutions. They're not talking to constituents, trying to assuage concerns and figure out what the next best steps are. And that's where I think a lot of my social media soundbite stuff comes from. Because a lot of the hate I receive as a Democrat is from stuff that's been shared kind of willy-nilly on social media. But then I have real conversations where I talk about what your family looks like, what your life looks like, you know, and we relate Idahoan to Idahoan, person to person. And none of that negativity comes in. None of that divisive rhetoric comes in. And we're actually able to move forward in a constructive way. So I think that's where that social media stuff comes up a lot, because it is such a huge kind of stormy cloud hanging over what politics should really be, which is bringing communities together for smart policy solutions.
You can't read the comments, though. Like, that's insanity.
Oh, I don't read comments.
Well, then how, you're talking about social media hate.
I'm talking about
You can't
stuff
read
that
them.
is coming
They
from
may be
elected
Russian,
representatives.
They may be Russian bots. You can never know.
No. It's funny. I hold my Republican town halls. I just had one in Coeur d'Alene, and a comment that I often get is, well, this person's saying this on social media. How do I get across to them? I'm like, Don't try and do it on social media. Do it with your neighbor, your grocery store. Like, talk to the people in your community. We're not going to change hearts and minds and relate to people through social media. The confrontation level is too high. There are way too many Russian bots trying to get people riled up. Do it in person. But the frustration comes in when you have elected officials using social media for that same agenda, who are using social media to try and get people riled up, to get them angry about the things they're supposed to be angry about, to try and get people believing that 50% of the country is against you and un-American and all of this stuff, which to me goes against everything that the oath of office means, that to be an elected official is. And that's, I think, where a lot of my disdain for social media comes in.
Let me ask you something. And I I really like to focus local, specifically Southwest Idaho. And, I've had conversations about the dams and things that are more statewide conversations, or conversations about public school systems throughout the state. But since we're talking national level, like, how do you view Biden as a candidate? I mean, like, because I meet plenty of Democrats that like, you're a good person. Maybe we disagree on details, but you're like, I've never met a Democrat who's like, I want worse public schools. And frankly, I've never met Republicans that are like, I want worse education for our kids. Right? Like, we agree on 99% of things, or 95, or whatever it might be.
Exactly.
Maybe, wiggle room on the details of how we get there. But like, the targets are still the same. We just have different expectations of how to get there. But like, the biggest blight is absolutely like the Biden as a candidate coming up. What are your thoughts?
It's a double-edged sword, right? I think that a lot of the frustration that goes towards Biden as a candidate is actually a frustration with a system that isn't working for people anymore. We have 85-year-olds.
I think it's that. Are you telling me that like watching Biden deliver a speech or create a message is like, oh, he's the guy. He's just being painted poorly?
I will say he is, and this is where the public speaking comes in to play, because he's not a great orator, right? We went from these candidates that can get people inspired and riled up and viewing. Biden's strength is not speaking. It never has been.
It used to be better, though. His strength in speaking was plenty fine when he was VP.
Most people have a lot easier time. Once you hit 80, things are a lot tougher. This is where we need to start.
I agree with you.
And I tell people, because unfortunately for a large swath of the population, the frustration with our two-party system in Biden means people just aren't going to vote. And what we absolutely need to solve this systemic issue is we need people to show up in droves and vote and focus on the local level. If you get candidates, working class, 35-year-old candidates, I'm actually 34. If you get younger candidates in and there's enough support, but as long as we have low voter turnout and it takes $3 million for a congressional candidate to get enough people out to the polls, then yeah, we're going to be stuck with the... And to be fair, I mean, the economy is better than it's ever been. We have more working class protections. The only thing, the FBI just raided a corporate landlord for a price fixing scheme. I mean, when was the last time?
What are you talking about? Like, Kaylee,
you have an administration that is focused on working class people.
We are having a great conversation, and you just went full blown like buzz clips, like greatest economy ever, landlord, FBI, like. What do we care about some crummy landlord in the FBI? What I care about is actually understanding who you are and what policies and philosophies you have.
Well,
and
you asked what I thought about Biden and his administration.
But then you didn't talk to me about him. You went off on an FBI raid.
Well, I'm talking about an administration that actually prioritized working class families for the first time in like 40 years.
Okay, well, first off, if you say that, then you're bagging on Clinton and Obama. And those were champions, at least a lot of middle class people feel they were champions of the middle class. So that's fine. They could have
done better.
Everybody could be better.
Right?
I'm a terrible interviewer. I could be better. That's not the point. The point is, when asked, you were like, all right, but talking's a little hard for Biden because he's old. Okay, that's fine. But like, is that it? Is your only comment on him that like talking is hard because he's old?
No, I'm looking at, we have two candidates, right? We have Biden and Trump. Both are old. Both are terrible speakers. Both get confused on stage. Both get tongue-tied. Both make gaffes. If we want to compare two candidates on how they communicate and how they are as human beings.
You don't have to compare Biden to Trump. I'm not asking for that. What I want to know is what you think of Biden. And this doesn't have to be like... This is an honest question.
I don't know him as a person. I don't know what you're asking for.
As a political candidate.
As a political candidate, I am frustrated that I feel like we're going to lose a large amount of young voters because they are so disinterested in voting for another 85-year-old white guy. That is my fear in the upcoming election. That is what I worry Biden's impact will be.
That he's going to turn off voters.
The young voters are just going to be like, I'm done with this. Why am I participating in a process that doesn't represent or, mirror my life and my interests and what I need America to be? Because that is my fear of him as a candidate.
Okay, great. So you think that his downside is more reflective of his age and, 85-year-old white guy.
Yeah.
As you put it, instead of okay. Are we establishing that it's a personal characteristic flaw that he's an old white guy, or is it that he's no longer serving the country as best as possible?
I'm saying, it's not a character flaw to get older. It shouldn't be. But
it can be a liability.
It's a liability if you're a candidate. And it's a liability for a country that's really coming to terms with the fact that our middle class is disappearing. It's much harder for Gen Z to make a living than it was for millennials and than it was for Gen Xers. Like, we're coming to terms with the fact that we're going to have to figure out a long-term solution to how middle class can thrive and how we grow up working class families into something long-term sustainable. And then you have another 80-year-old candidate. And, when we look at what the administration has done, I'm excited to see that some of the focus is back on how we repair the middle class. The CHIPS and Science Act. I mean, Idaho alone, we've got $15 billion investment from Micron that was fought for quite dearly. And all of those are going to have, the vast majority of that construction is going to have labor agreements, which is fantastic for working class people here in the state. Micron's got another $6 billion investment. We're now going to be able to compete with China in semiconductor. We have somebody that's focused on long-term benefits for working class families. And this is the first time I've really seen that kind of focus and emphasis that I can remember. I mean, sure, Clinton had a surplus, but, you know, we also have to look at the deficit and what's causing it and all of that. But yeah, I'm happy with what the administration has done. People are upset because they can't afford to live right now. And unfortunately, those aren't things that are federally regulated.
Okay, here's a question for you then. If people are upset that they can't live well right now, or they can't live right now, as you said, how do we reconcile? Because I've heard the argument that it's like, we have the best economy ever, but then we follow it up with, but people are frustrated because they can't live. So how do you reconcile those two things?
I would say that Wall Street's economy does not equate working class success. And I'm tired of us saying the same thing. But a lot of people said before the Biden administration that he was going to be a disaster, that our GDP was going to drop, that the economy was going to tank, that we were going to have the greatest recession of all time. I usually bring that up to show like, okay, well, the things that we feared were going to happen before the Biden administration took over have not happened. In fact, it's the opposite. But on the other side of that coin, he is also focusing on middle class, working class issues and how we bring back the kind of wages and healthcare and benefits and things so that our middle class can sustain.
Okay, but if that's true, how come you're saying now middle class can't live? If you're saying, I mean, you referenced the, hey, look, we have the worst, we have the best economy, but then you're like, okay, it's only the best economy for Wall Street. It's not the best economy for actual working class Americans. So that's really not like a feather in his cap then.
Here's where the issue is. When you talk to people about what they can't afford, it's gas, it's groceries, it's clothing, it's fast food. All of these things are not currently regulated. All of these are corporations that really have no federal insight into what they've done. In fact, these are all industries that we have slowly been cutting the tax rates from for the last 45 years. And unfortunately, what we've done is we've hurt our ability for capitalism to be successful, because in order for our capitalist society to be successful, we need competition. And over the last 45 years, we are more monopolized than we have ever been before, with very little regulation. And so we have corporate profits coming up, we have shortcuts, and none of that is looking at how the employee is faring. You don't look at, okay, my employees are faring well, the company is doing good, so now what does the CEO make? We look at what the shareholders and Wall Street need before we look at the long-term kind of success and ability to thrive of the company itself.
Okay, a question for you then. You just referenced investments in Micron and a couple other large, what were those investments you were talking about?
The CHIPS and Science Act.
Yeah, great. But that's not capitalism, right? Selecting money from the federal government, which is actually taxpayer dollars, and then selecting winners and losers that you're going to invest in, that's not capitalism.
Now here, this is where it gets really interesting, because the CHIPS and Science Act, what differentiated that from what we've been doing for the last 45 years is there is incredible accountability for how every dollar of that is spent. It has to go into manufacturing. Now, here's the difference. Over the last 45 years, we have been handing out hundreds of billions of dollars in corporate welfare, subsidies, with no accountability. And we know for a fact from the data that the majority of that money went into stock buybacks, CEO bonuses, things that really only benefited the stakeholders. And then those industries, some of which we've been paying to fail, then needed to get bailed out and then got even more money from the federal government. What I'm saying is I want to make sure that we have some kind of oversight. So unfortunately, antitrust legislation isn't as exciting as I wish it could be.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, we need to be making sure we don't have monopolized industries. We need to make sure that Jeff Bezos can't just on a whim decide to spend $500,000 and crush small companies because he doesn't want the competition.
We can't go from a reasonable conversation to referencing what Jeff Bezos can and can't do, because then it's all over if we do that. Like we have to, like if we're talking, what I'm saying is, hey, the federal government is, and with whatever oversight you feel is appropriate or not, the federal government is actually selecting companies that it will take U.S. taxpayer dollar and invest in. So Micron benefits immensely. And that's not helping the small micron, like the cousin micron or the second cousin removed that's trying to come up. It's like Micron just got this dump of money.
Right. But I mean, when we look at the industry as a whole, we are supposed to be finding solutions. I mean, semiconductor, what we saw during COVID is that American manufacturing had tanked. Most of these corporations that have gotten these tax cuts, that have gotten these subsidies, that have gotten all of these things, then went and outsourced labor and took all of these moves to even further shortcut and try and drive up profit margins. And we know that for record amount of times, corporations are hitting record profits. But that isn't funneling down. Employees aren't seeing higher income. We're not seeing better benefits. We're not seeing all of these things that one would expect if companies are thriving. And that's because there's no expectation. What I'm saying is that if we're going to spend a single dollar of taxpayer money going to a company, I want to know that that's going towards jobs. I want to go that's going towards long-term manufacturing capabilities of our country. I want to know that that's going towards some kind of industry that we as America need to be supporting in order to compete with countries like China. That's what made the Chips and Science Act so special. Not only that, but the money that the government put into the Chips and Science Act, it was shown that over $200 billion of private sector money then also went into semiconductor and the same kind of research. So it stimulated the private sector, started more competition, started more manufacturing, had better jobs, the number of jobs, the amount of pay for jobs. That's where I think we need to start being strategic instead of just kind of handing them out willy-nilly and being like, well, we hope this helps. So I think that's where I'm talking about. I am not for giving corporations tax dollars. That is not my platform. But what I'm saying is what we've seen over the last 2 years is it being done smarter and more strategically with more accountability than we've seen in the last 45.
There's a lot. This is a lot. God bless it. We may have to do round two because we've been going for a while here. And we haven't even hit on international policy or anything of that nature, which surely will send us down a rabbit hole.
I live 16 minutes away from you, so I can come back anytime.
What do you have anything that you would like to say in closing then? Because we've covered a lot of things. And again, I know we've missed a whole swath of big concerns that people have.
I think the most important part is just what we expect from candidates, what we expect from leadership, because I think we've gotten into this rut where we just want to elect somebody who's going to say the same things, to say what we believe, to yell about the same things that frustrate us. And our frustrations are valid. I get that want. But what we really need is leadership that is willing to look beyond that, who's willing to have people sit down, who's willing to unite people towards just solutions, who isn't going to demonize your neighbor, who's going to demonize the obstacles that we all face towards what we consider the American dream. And I want us to have those kind of high standards for elected officials again: integrity, accountability, transparency, conversation. People might not agree with everything I have to say, but I can guarantee you my door's always open to have these conversations and to change my mind if better information comes along. And I'd really like to see, on a wide scale, for Idaho to start seeing that in politics again.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for coming in. Thank you for what you're doing. It cannot be easy. And then you got to come on podcasts with jerks like me. So I appreciate you. Thank you for representing a voice and giving people something to rally around.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. These conversations are incredible. And I do love policies. So conversations like this are a gift. I appreciate it.
We'll have to get back to it. All right.
Deal.
Thank you. MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.